Today on Northern Revolutions, I've got two special guests. I'll be joined by Chris Propfe, musically obsessed, and Brian from Embryonic Robot. Three of us are going to have a chat about the legacy and the music and our appreciation of Gordon Lightfoot, a legend that we lost just recently. Also, this episode will be airing as an installment of the Vinyl Community Podcasts. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, you can find the Vinyl Community Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts, be it Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Amazon, you name it. So if you want to hear this on the go, check out Vinyl Community Podcasts. Stay tuned. Thank you for joining us, folks. My name is Rob from the YouTube Vinyl Community channel, Northern Revolutions. I'm joined by two guests today, Brian from Embryonic Robot and Chris Propfe from Chris Propfe Musically Obsessed, both also YouTube Vinyl Community channels that I encourage everyone to check out. Thanks for joining me today, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
My pleasure. I thought we would have a discussion as music fans and record collectors, and Chris is more of a musician than I am. Well, I do have guitars. I wouldn't call myself a musician. Chris, I would. But I thought it would be an interesting discussion today to talk about one of the legends that we lost recently, Gordon Lightfoot, who I want to say legendary, I think would probably be a pretty adequate description of him. Either of you, what was your sort of what was your gut reaction when you heard the news that he'd passed away a few weeks ago?
Yeah, I couldn't believe it, and it's funny because I was thinking about I like before we started recording today, I told you guys that I saw him live, and recently I've been like, I want to see Gordon Lightfoot live again, because I'm like, he's not going to be around for much longer, and he's such a legend, and then I heard of his passing, and I was just blown away. And I think it was either that day or the day after that I made my, kind of tribute to Gordon Lightfoot, because I had to say something, because his music has, spoken to me throughout the years. And, so it definitely hit me hard.
Yeah. What about you, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, obviously sadness. He, as a man in his 80s, it's sort of wonderful we had him so long. It could have been worse. And in fact, he had that serious issue with health back in the early 2000s, I think, where he's in the hospital for quite a while. Yep. And then the death hoax. So bizarrely, I was thinking, wow, we're lucky to have had him, because we could have lost him a long time ago. So sadness, of course, lucky that we had him as long as we did. But oddly, the thing that I thought about most was the fact that, you mentioned earlier, Rob, before we went out live, is all the musicians who thought of him as a real influence and as a pioneer. And I kept thinking about people like those musicians what were they thinking? That's what I was wondering, what were they thinking about this event? It would have been very sad for them. So all those kinds of conflicted things about sadness, but happiness, he lived to be 84, and that we didn't lose him sooner. That's that kind of thing. So
I sort of had a similar reaction. I mean, I wasn't terribly shocked because he was 84.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if anyone had seen him in the last several years, I mean, he looked his age and then some. He had kind of led a hard life, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it was not a secret that his health was not as good as it had been. He recently postponed some dates, so it wasn't a terrible shock. But at the same time, I couldn't help. The first thing I thought of was just this, and I had, musicians I like have passed away before. This was the first time I really actually felt this sense of loss, like something he's missing. He, and I'm sure we'll get into this, looms so large in our musical tapestry in Canada that, it's kind of like he was the guy that went first. He was kind of like the wise old grandfather, and all of a sudden he's gone, and you're like, the guy that has led the path for us all isn't here anymore. So it was a weird one. It was surreal that I was, profoundly affected by someone I've never met. And the second thought for me was I'd never got to see him live. And I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to get to see him perform. Right. So that was kind of a sad thing. I think what everyone sort of associates, especially in recent weeks, is his legacy that he leaves behind. And I think that's maybe worth exploring. And maybe Chris, you can go first, being the American on this panel. What is his legacy mean for you as not only as an American, but as a human being in general? I'm curious what a perspective of someone outside of Gordon's native land means of, what does he mean to you guys?
Yeah, when I first started getting into Gordon Lightfoot, it was just, because of the music. And then I started to realize that I didn't realize he wrote so many songs that other people covered. Like I'm into Peter, Paul and Mary, and of course Johnny Cash and Dylan and everything. And, I didn't realize he wrote the song "That's What You Get for Loving Me" and all this other stuff. So that started to, once artists that you know and love cover songs of somebody else, you're like, oh, you start to gain more respect for that person. And then, listening to other Canadians talk about him, they basically said that he embodied Canada. And, as you said, I'm an American. I mean, I've been to Canada, but, I'm definitely not a Canadian. But it's funny, though, when I listen to Gordon Lightfoot's music, it does give me that sort of vibe. And I hate to just say Canadian vibe, but his culture and his country come out in his music. Not only, and I was playing some Gordon Lightfoot today at a barbecue with my kids were there. And, it comes down to not only the way he speaks, but just his lyrics that he has, his arrangements of his music. I guess what I'm saying is I can see why people say he embodies Canada. And I'm saying that as an American, and I still feel that from him, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely it does. Yeah, absolutely it does. I think I'll come back to that in a sec. There's also, musically, aside from the Canadian cultural aspect, I've heard so many musicians around the world in the last, couple of weeks that, have put out statements and said, irrespective of the Canadian culture side of it, just what he did as a musician, as a composer, as someone, putting together, harmonies and rhythms and doing all those kind of things. Dylan said, and I'm going to butcher the quote, and I don't know when this was from, but he essentially said that, Gordon Lightfoot songs are perfect and he wished they would go on forever. Do you hear any of that sort of reverence in terms of the musical aspect of it?
Yeah, I wanted to say this too, and this kind of go along with what you said. Good music paints a picture in your head, and it kind of touches on all senses. And I feel like when Gordon Lightfoot writes music, and I'll just say the song, the Canadian Railroad Trilogy, I feel like he talks about the beauty of Canada. He talks about the sights, the sounds, the smells. And I feel that when he's singing and the way he's written his music. So, and again, even though I'm not in Canada, I feel like I am when I'm listening to his music, because he paints the beauty of your country through his music. And a good writer can do that.
Well, it's good. I sort of have I have that feeling too, but I didn't know, whether that was my own sort of cultural bias weighing in there. So it's interesting that you sort of get that same thoughts from him. What are your thoughts on his legacy, Brian, as a fellow Canadian from not too far from where Gordon was born and lived his life?
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious things like, 20 records and all the Juno Awards that he won. But I think for me, I always think about, he's sort of the blueprint for how to be successful in Canada. So many Canadians went to the United States. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Like Neil Young went down, Leonard Cohen went down, and other places. Bruce Coburn's living there now. So that idea of like, how can you stay in Canada and maintain your Canadian identity and actually have a successful career? And how do you exert your cultural identity when you're so close to such a large country? Like, was it like 80 or 85% of Canadians live within a close range of
85% is within 100 miles of the border.
Yeah. So that, I mean, I think about that he did go to the LA for a couple of years. And
3 years.
There. Yeah. So he did that. But I think that, I really think there's a bit of the blueprint there of how you maintain that identity. And I think that his legacy also has to be in the number of musicians that looked up to him as an inspiration. Everybody from, you've mentioned some like Blue Rodeo, we got Ron Sexsmith, Bruce Coburn. I saw an interview with him recently. He talked about Gordon Lightfoot. They didn't know each other very well, but he talked about him as being influential. And so many other people, Ronnie Hawkins, all these people who looked up to him. And I think without him, it's interesting to think about what would have been the trajectory of Canadian, like that sort of folk pop Canadian sound that he had. What would have taken his place? And that's something to think about. So I think that all those things wrapped up, I think, are important to think about.
That's the thing I think about most when I think about him and I think about his legacy. I am a admitted nerd for, Canadian music, and I sort of like to, on YouTube, I like to say sort of the self-proclaimed ambassador of at least mentioning those bands. I'm sure people are sick of me talking about bands I've never heard of before, and they don't do it purposely to be obscure, but that's the genre that I'm passionate about. And really, he was the guy that really, essentially he started our music industry. I mean, when he was a struggling singer-songwriter in the early 60s, playing in coffee shops and stuff and bars and whatever, there wasn't a Canadian music industry to speak of. And to your point, everyone that wanted to do anything went south of the border. And that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But there wasn't really a place for homegrown music. And he really he created sort of the mold or the archetype for the singer-songwriter that now is plentiful up here. I mean, everyone that I love immensely in Canadian music, every single one of them will say it's because of Gordon Lightfoot. I mean, I talk about people like Kathleen Edwards, incredible singer-songwriter, great roots band, the Skydiggers. Probably my favorite guy ever. And this album, I think, is probably the closest modern album to a Gordon Lightfoot album. This is Adam Baldwin. Chris talked about how Gordon Lightfoot painted words with pictures. This is exactly what, Adam was a rock guy, but this is a folk album. And he does, the songs here are very much like Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald or Canadian Railroad Trilogy. How this got overlooked by the Juno Committee, I have no idea. And then, of course, legends like Blue Rodeo. Jim and Greg have come out and said if it wasn't for Gordon Lightfoot, they would have stayed in New York City and been a struggling bar band. So for me, his legacy is that he beat the path and really was the foundation of our music industry up here. So
yeah, and
what a legacy.
And I think it goes on to even music that doesn't really sound like the music you just showed.
Of course.
For example, the Rio Statics covered the record.
Absolutely.
Tragically Hip. That's a very Canadian band too. And I remember that I saw a clip of them playing Nautical Disaster, and Gord Downey introduced it as being a song by Gordon Lightfoot. And I was, because it's a Nautical Disaster. And I wonder how many people in the audience probably took him at his word that it was a Lightfoot song.
That's a good joke.
Well, I was going to mention the Bare Naked Ladies as well, because their first album was called Gordon, and I looked it up. It's not actually named after Gordon Lightfoot, I guess. And I don't know if this is like funny, because obviously the Bare Naked Ladies have a sense of humor, but I guess they named it after Typhoon Gordon that hit the Philippines in 1989. Who knows if that's true? I always thought it was because of Gordon Lightfoot, but I did want to mention on their children's album called Snack Time, they've got a song called the Canadian Snack Time Trilogy. And on here, Gordon Lightfoot makes an appearance. He says that it's funny because he says its favorite snack is, well, he says pasta, where we say pasta, and my kids always thought that was funny. They're like, "What's pasta?" I'm like, "It's pasta. It's just the accent." So, but basically, Gordon Lightfoot appears on this album. So
I didn't know that. That's
this is a really cool record too by the Bare Naked Ladies. And obviously the Bare Naked Ladies became huge here. I was also gonna mention the band, the Guess who are also a Canadian band, obviously.
Love them.
On their album Wheatfield Soul, they have a song called Lightfoot.
Yep.
Where they talk about how magical Gordon is. So, and that was back, when did that album come out? Late 60s, early 70s? I can't remember.
Early 70s, I think.
Yeah. But, so I feel like he's not like, Gordon is not like you, for me, it's hard to point to people that he's influenced, but I feel like he still has influenced people, but maybe not in ways that are so recognizable.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
You have to think a little.
Do either of you recall sort of, maybe the first Lightfoot song you heard, or the first time that you went, wow, that's something?
Yeah. You know what? I was hanging out with my friend. We would always drive around just listening to music, and he put on he had it on CD, but he put on this album, Gord's Gold. And I'm like, first of all, who is this guy on the front cover? He's like, sort of like, he's got a lot of hair. He looks
like an axe murderer on the cover of that album.
Yeah, I'm like, who is this guy?
Yeah, that's right.
And then is that song in here? Yeah. If You Could Read My Mind came on. And I'm like, I know this freaking song. And I'm like, and then there's just something about Gordon's vocal delivery. He sounds like nobody else.
Right.
And I think from that point, he connected with me, because I'm like, there's something about this guy that I want to listen to his music. And so that was, and I know that was one of his biggest hits, but If You Could Read My Mind was probably the first song that I made that connection to him with.
Sure.
Yeah.
You, Brian?
Well, I'm sure the thing is, growing up in Canada, I'm sure I heard lots of his songs without thinking about it. But the first song that really captured my attention, like so many others, was probably The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald from this record, because my dad had it. So, when I think of Gordon Lightfoot, I think of my dad, because
everybody has it.
We've all got it. For those that are watching on YouTube, you'll see all three of us holding up the same album, Summertime Dream.
Right. And I will say the funny thing about it is it's one of the few artists my dad liked and I liked it as a kid. And I think I didn't even know he was Canadian. I'm pretty sure I heard the song on the radio and didn't know he was Canadian, but I think everyone was captivated by that song. It's astounding that it was a single, because it was so long, like 6.5 minutes. Like, how did that happen?
And there's no chorus.
There's no chorus. And my understanding is that the first time they played it was the time they recorded it. Like, there was no rehearsals. Like that is the thing.
That's what I heard too.
Yeah. So my introduction would have been probably lots of other songs that I don't remember, but then this song, because it captivated so many people, because it was such an epic, such a great track. So that's probably it.
It's a magical opening. The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down. And you're like, the Chippewa, like, who puts that in a song?
Right.
And I don't know, there's just something that just draws you in from that first line.
And there's something else about that song that I was just thinking about recently. There's lots you could say about it in terms of like the guitar work and that sort of thing. But this is a song that I don't think I've ever sung along to, because every time it's on, I just want to hear it. Like, I want to listen to him say the words, even though you know what they are. But I have never sung along to that song, which is a pretty weird thing to say about a song you like.
Right.
And I think that's probably true. You just sit in reverence listening to the lyrics, even though you know exactly what's going to happen, you know how it's going, but you just can't bring yourself to sing to it because you want to hear him say the words.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting.
I'm with you on that. And I'll circle back a second time to something that Chris said earlier about how he can, paint a picture with words. For those that don't know, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is about a Great Lakes freighter that sunk in a storm, and all the men on board perished. And that was in 72, I think. And they didn't find the Edmund Fitzgerald wreck until it was in the 90s, I believe. Yeah. So no one knew what happened. Essentially, the story goes when the ship left port, it was in close proximity to another ship, and there was radio contact. And all of a sudden, it just disappeared. Never found a body. Never found anything. But to listen to this song, you'd swear Gordon was on the ship.
Yeah,
I mean, the story that he tells, and the pictures that he paints with his imagination, like what probably happened, and I love it, and I've heard it hundreds and hundreds of times, and you just listen to it with such what's the word, like emotional trepidation or whatever, because you're just like, man, I know where this is going, and I feel bad for these people, and it's just what an incredible song.
Yeah,
just amazing. My first memory, and like Brian, I mean, the radio was always on at home, and my dad was always playing records. So I'm sure by osmosis, I had heard dozens and dozens of Lightfoot songs while not being really cognizant that that's, in fact, what I was hearing. And I've told the story that I didn't get into music until I was probably 14, 15, so in the early 90s. And my first distinct Gordon Lightfoot memory, I think it was grade 9 English class. We had a teacher who Chris reminds me a lot of, being a teacher that plays guitar. And
so he was tall, handsome, and
he was old with a big beard and thinning white hair, and
okay. Yeah, that's
his name was Jamie McIntosh. Wonderful man. I think it was him that did it, or it might have been one of my other English teachers, but I kind of think it was him. And we were doing whatever it was we were studying, but they played the Canadian Railroad Trilogy for us to illustrate some kind of, I don't know whether it was some kind of creative writing or poetry. No recollection of what the actual lesson was. But the first time I heard that song in English class, I was just blown away for all the same reasons. The images it paints. And I mean, I don't know that there's a better song that he wrote that really encapsulates sort of the Canadian experience. So I was just, wow, what is this? And when I got home, parents are, what did you do at school today? Dad, I heard the Canadian Railroad Trilogy. And that's when this album came out, Sundown. Dad's like, well, you got to hear Sundown because it's Gordon Lightfoot. And so it was, that was my first recollection of Gordon Lightfoot. So
I just want to say something along those lines. I thought of another artist who I'm a huge fan of, and it's Johnny Cash. And the thing is, like, when you're talking about the Canadian Railroad Trilogy, Gordon Lightfoot is putting history in sort of I'm not going to say pop, because that's more of like a folk, but it's an accessible way for people to hear history. Yep. Johnny Cash does the same thing. I mean, Johnny Cash had a whole record of the Apache Indian, but he made it in the form of a song where you could listen to it and you were learning something at the same time. So I liken Gordon Lightfoot to a Johnny Cash. I think maybe even more than a Dylan.
Right. So that documentary kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which comes up in Black Day in July, obviously. That's a very interesting song too. So
but
so for those that are listening to this and maybe have not given him any attention or whatever, what's if you were to suggest an on-ramp or a gateway for folks, where would you have them start?
Well, I mean, the obvious choice is Gord's Gold because you get a lot of the hits, but
shamefully I don't own that.
Oh, really?
Yes.
My absolute favorite album by him is an album called Shadows.
Oh yeah.
And this one came out in 1982. So it's a later album of his. But first of all, I've always loved the cover art. It's literally like a sort of a shadowy image of him on the front. And you've got 14 Karat Gold, which I think was a pretty big hit for him. The song In My Fashion, which was a hit for him. But the title track, Shadows, is just an amazingly written song. And I don't think a lot of people know about this record. It's my favorite. So I would say after Gord's Gold, I mean, obviously Summertime Dream as well, but Shadows, you don't let too many records go by before you listen to Shadows.
Yeah, I'd say Gord's Gold, obviously. Good recommendations, but Gord's Gold obviously is the one I think that is a good entry point for me anyway. It's probably one of the first, it might have been one of the first ones I've owned. I own possibly, so.
And just so folks know, while it is a greatest hits of the first portion of his career, they're all re-recorded for that album. So they're not just plucked. They're all contemporary performances of those songs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And his voice on this record, I mean, it's just phenomenal. He has this deep sort of baritone, and the vibrato on his voice he just has a beautiful voice. That's why when I saw him live a few years back, of course he can't sing like he used to. He was in his 80s, but it was a little jarring at first because you're used to that beautiful lilting voice of his. And then it kind of came down to this mere shell of what it used to be. But again, he was in his 80s, so that's understandable. He started to lose his voice, though, and I don't know what happened in the early 80s. So I don't know what it was. I'd have to read up on it, but you'll see his voice got a little thinner and thinner and thinner. And then like by the mid-80s on, it just wasn't what it used to be. So I don't know what that can be attributed to.
Too many cigarettes, I think.
Maybe too much. He was a drinker as well.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm surprised his liver lasted 84 years.
That's a good point.
Looking at the track list of Gord's Gold, you've got Ribbon of Darkness, Song for a Winter's Night, which is amazing. You've got Canadian Railroad Trilogy. What For Love and Me? Did She Mention My Name? You've got Bitter Green, Early Morning Rain, Minstrel of the Dawn, Sundown. The reason I'm listing all these is because this guy wrote so many songs. Rainy Day People, Cotton Jenny, Old Dan's Records, If You Could Read My Mind, Cold in the Shoulder, Carefree. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of the killer tunes that he wrote.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So was that your recommendation too, Brian? Gord's Gold?
I would.
Is there any others?
Yeah, I think Gord's Gold is. I think if you listen to that record and you find something in there that you like, then just pick up the others. And funny thing is, he was for many years the only good record you could find in thrift shops for a long time, a long time. And I don't find them anymore. But at one point, you'd go in and the only thing there were Gordon Lightfoot records. I just grab whatever I could find, but not any longer. So.
Yeah, you could always count on finding that, and you could always count on finding Hot Shots by Trooper was always in thrift shops, and you'd always find that first album by The Knack. Those were always, without fail, you'll find those in thrift shops. But you're right, I don't see much Lightfoot anymore. But
no,
maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that means people are picking them up.
I think so.
I would echo what you guys said. If I were to on-ramp somebody, I would say Gord's Gold, obviously, which. Sadly, I don't own, but
yeah.
And then if I were to say, okay, you like that, you want to dig a little bit deeper, I'm going Sundown.
Yeah.
Love the record. Obviously, Sundown, the title track, was his biggest hit internationally, as far as I know. Carefree Highway is on here. Interestingly, and I can't share all the details of the story, but the night that Gordon passed away, I was talking to a friend of mine that knew Gordon quite well because he's also a Canadian musician. And he shared with me the story of Sundown and who it is actually about, because Gordon's never said publicly. So I know who it's about, and I actually know that person as well. But that was interesting because I've always loved that song, and it's not about who you think it's about or who everyone thinks it's about. So interesting story. I've been asked not to share the details, but
it's and what's funny is it's a pop song about a stalker.
Correct.
And it's like, if you look into the lyrics, you're probably like, oh, this is not the song I thought it was.
Right, because it certainly sounds like a very sort of upbeat kind of yeah.
And talking about folk music, that song has an amazing groove for a folk song. When you think about it, that song just killer.
Yep,
the melody in that song.
Yep.
I love that song. That's on here too, Sundown.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
My copy looks more faded than yours, Brian, but
maybe my lighting is different.
It's like a darker,
yeah.
But
I'm gonna have to go to the record store this week and try and find a copy because I feel left out of the club that I don't have one.
Well, what's funny is this is on Reprise Records, but that's the label, which you don't really see that label that often.
No. This is more of the the Reprise one we have here.
So this is obviously a later pressing.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't have any other Reprise records that have that label.
It looks unfamiliar.
Yeah.
There's another, and it's only available on CD, and I'm going to have to track it down. And this might not be everybody's cup of tea, but back in 2003, and I'll put a graphic of this up on the screen so folks that are watching on YouTube can see it. I have it digitally. I don't have it in physical form. But there was a Gordon Lightfoot tribute album done back in 2003. It was called Beautiful, a tribute to Gordon Lightfoot.
Nice.
And many of those artists that I talked about that are Canadian, that are inspired by Gordon Lightfoot, came together and made one amazing tribute album. Just absolutely fantastic. Blue Rodeo, Bruce Coburn. Anyone that was anyone. Cowboy
Junkies.
Yeah. It's a fantastic tribute album. So I'll have to see if I can track one of those down. It's kind of scarce, I think.
I think Ron Sexsmith is also on that
record. Absolutely.
Yes.
There's another incredible singer-songwriter that's got Gordon Lightfoot fingerprints all over it.
Yeah, and he said as much. Sexsmith said recently that I think he said repeatedly over the years that Lightfoot was a big inspiration to him, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Chris, you being a musician, what Lightfoot songs do you like to play?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys know, but I'm in a band. I know I've mentioned that on my channel before, but we do Sundown, and we do.
Do you play it on a 12-string like he did?
I play it on the 6-string.
Nice.
And we're a 3-piece, so it's just a bass player, a lead player, and then myself on acoustic and vocals. But yeah, we do Sundown, we do Edmund Fitzgerald, and I want to do Carefree Highway. But every time you do the songs, people love them. And but what's cool is you don't really hear those songs on the radio that much. So when people hear them, they're like, "Oh man, I haven't heard that song in forever." The only reason we haven't been playing Edmund Fitzgerald is it's so long.
Yeah,
it's like, I mean, I have the lyrics in front of me. I don't know how he remembered all those lyrics, but Gordon Lightfoot songs go over pretty well, and I've kind of been able to kind of replicate his voice a little bit. I try to make, like, if I'm singing Johnny Cash, I'll kind of put my Johnny Cash on, and I've listened to Gordon Lightfoot so many times that when I'm singing, I can kind of sound a little like Gordon. And again, I'm not going to say I sound just like Gordon Lightfoot. I'm just saying that I can kind of do it. So that helps with getting the song across as well. But
I don't know if you guys have ever. There's another YouTube channel, very famous record producer Rick Beato. I don't know if you've ever seen his channel or not. He did an incredible tribute to Gordon Lightfoot. A couple nights after he died, where he went through some of his songs and just from a musical production standpoint talked about how absolutely incredible they are. I'm going to leave a link to that video in the description because it's certainly well worth checking out. So,
well, I think the other thing too is we have to talk about his guitar playing as well. He was a phenomenal guitar player. The finger picking style that he had, and most of the time it was done on an acoustic guitar. So, we can't under whatever his guitar playing.
That's a good point because that does. I mean, I think of him as singer-songwriter. I don't often think that he is as great of a guitar player as he is.
Yeah.
I agree. I'm not qualified to talk about his guitar playing, but I agree with you that
I
people
barely
talk
am,
about him.
so.
They will say singer-songwriter. They will talk about times he's been covered, but they never. You're right. They never seem to mention his guitar. Well, I shouldn't say never. They don't often mention his guitar playing. So that's a good point.
Yeah. No, definitely. He had a distinctive finger picking style.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you guys have any sort of final thoughts you wanna throw out there? Anything that any stories, any insights, any lasting legacies, anything you want to?
Well, I mean, when I saw him live, like I said, he couldn't sing like he used to. But once you got over that, you could just see that he was a performer. He liked to be on stage. His banter between songs he could just spin a web of stories for you. And just, and you'd have the whole audience just hanging on every word that he was saying. And he was soft-spoken about it, but he had this sense of humor. And you could just tell that he was a master at what he did, not only at writing, but also performing his songs and connecting with the audience. So that was amazing. That was amazing to see.
Well, I was at a concert 2 nights ago on Friday night. I went to see a band called Whitehorse, who I absolutely love, another talented Canadian singer-songwriter group. I went to see them. They were playing in a church.
Yeah.
Odd place, but nevertheless, it was an incredible show. I'll have a video about that later this week. But they played their whole show. And they went back and everyone claps and come out to do an encore. The first encore song was one of theirs, and then they closed with Sundown.
Nice.
And not a single person, and there had to be 300-400 people there. Not a single person was seated. Everybody was clapping. Everybody was singing. And it was the highlight of the night. And it was just sort of their homage to their hero. And it was wonderful how that connected with everyone in the audience. There were old people there. There were young people there. And everyone was just sort of caught up in that moment. So it was wonderful.
He's so underrated as a songwriter. I mean, when you talk about Canadian musicians, obviously Neil Young comes up and Joni Mitchell and Rush and, blah, blah, blah. But very rarely do you hear Gordon Lightfoot. And I don't think people realize how many freaking songs this guy wrote. And he was sort of flew under the radar.
Yeah.
But when you discover him, he's got so many albums of just wonderful music. So anybody out there, if you haven't listened to Gordon Lightfoot, start, like we all said, start with Gord's Gold. But then if you like it, just go on from there. Any album you pick up, you're going to like.
He recorded 500 songs in his career.
Wow.
Yeah.
Which is a staggering amount when you think about it. And it's slightly different perspective, I think, and Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned, Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. I think generally he is regarded as sort of one of the proverbial Mount Rushmore of Canadian musicians. I think, we think of the greatest.
Maybe down here.
Yeah.
Not.
I think up here,
yeah.
we look at, if you were to poll 100 people, who are the greatest ever Canadian musicians, you'd probably always hear Gordon Lightfoot, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, and probably Rush. I think. I don't. Correct me if I'm wrong, Brian. But
I think you're right, and that's what's come out in the press since May 2nd is the fact that he's often that statement greatest Canadian songwriter. So I think he does have a lot of reverence up here for sure.
So I guess he's more
everybody
in America.
And everybody knows some of his music, whether they're aware of it or not.
Yeah, even if it's a cover version.
Right. It's so widespread in the airwaves up here that even if you don't know it, you know it. So slightly different, but ever present, I guess you could say.
Right.
So.
Yep.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me tonight and having a little chat about the late, great Gordon Lightfoot. I appreciate you joining me.
Oh, it was fun. Thanks.
All right, folks. Thank you for watching or listening to another episode of the Vinyl Community Podcasts, wherever you're podcasts can be found. And those that are watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks to my guests, Brian and Chris.